As a child, I read a book called Beavers. It told the story of prehistoric people known as the pile dwellers, settlers who built their homes right on top of lakes. I will admit, I was not much of a reader back then, and I remember being skeptical at first, but once I started, something shifted. There were moments of tension, long canoe journeys to trade with distant settlements, uncertainty about whether strangers could be trusted, and then there were quiet moments, scenes of daily life, nets drying in the sun, water barely moving beneath the wooden platforms. For a child, it felt distant and dangerous. That world stayed with me. Then, a few months ago, I saw a glamping resort, and it reminded me of that book. All this gave me an idea. So today, I want you to step into that world together with me. Not as myth, but as history. Let's step into the world that existed more than 7,000 years ago. Beneath the still and quiet waters of marshes and lakes, something extraordinary was waiting to be uncovered. And in 1854, during an unusually dry winter at Lake Zurich, water levels dropped dramatically. What emerged from the mud were thousands of wooden posts driven deep into the lake bed. At first, people didn't fully understand what they were looking at, but as more material surfaced, pottery, tools, animal bones, fragments of textiles, it became clear that these weren't just debris. It was a settlement, and not just one. Over time, similar sites were discovered across the Alpine region, around lakes in Switzerland, southern Germany, Austria, northern Italy, eastern France, and Slovenia. One of the most important areas is the Ljubljana marshes, where some of the earliest known pile-dwelling settlements date back to around 5000 BCE. What makes these sites extraordinary isn't only their age, it's their preservation. Normally, prehistoric villages leave behind stone tools and broken pottery, wood, fabric, rope, baskets. All of that usually disappears. But in waterlogged soil, oxygen is limited, and without oxygen, organic materials decay much more slowly. So here, entire wooden posts survived. Fragments of woven cloth, seeds, food remains, even pieces of bread. In some cases, researchers even found footprints pressed into clay. I started building almost right in the middle. This structure will basically set the tone for the rest of the build. So I wanted the buildings to be mostly made of wood, and I kind of did just that. But since Tiny Glade doesn't have proper wooden walls, I had to stack frames to kind of imitate timber, which did end up causing a bit of an issue when I tried to place windows. I ended up experimenting with the stair tool to make imitation windows, like you can see here, for example. Even though the bottom floor here is a bit blocky, I made the upper floor open to balance the look on this building. Living near water offered advantages, but it also required constant maintenance. Archaeological layers show repeated rebuilding in the same places, meaning communities returned, repaired, and reinforced. It was architecture shaped entirely by environment. Practical, ingenious, and surprisingly effective. When we imagine prehistoric villages, we often picture small groups surviving on their own, but the evidence tells a different story. These communities were connected, sometimes across surprisingly long distances. Objects made from alpine copper have been found far from where the ore was mined. Baltic amber appears in regions hundreds of kilometers from the sea. Marine shells have been discovered deep inland. That means trade networks already existed thousands of years ago. They likely traveled by canoes along rivers and lakes, exchanging furs, dried fish, grains, tools, and other crafted items. Many supplies had to be kept dry. They needed to stay safe from rot. Raised buildings like this one would have protected valuable goods from damp ground and pests. Textile production was also really important. They cultivated flax. The fibers were soaked, dried, spun into thread, and woven on simple looms. Loom weights have been found at several sites. Found pottery also tells us about their life. Their pots were shaped by hand. They didn't have pottery wheels yet in the early periods. Clay was formed, smooth, sometimes decorated with simple incised patterns, and then fired in open hearts. Some pots were purely functional, others were more carefully finished. Those pots were perhaps used for rituals or special events. And then there were tools: bone needles, antler handles, flint blades set into wooden handles, stone axes, just to name a few. The wet soil preserved even the wooden parts, which almost never survive at other prehistoric sites. That preservation allows us to see not just the sharp stone blade, but the full tool as it was once made and used. Next, I built the storage house. It also includes a small dock and a canoe for transport. The slanted roof wasn't originally planned to look like this. I again experimented with the stair tool and decided to keep the look because it kind of visually separates the building from the rest of the structures. Pile dwellers weren't warriors. Their settlements show very little evidence of large-scale conflicts. What we do see is something else: steady food production. They farmed. Charred remains of wheat, barley, lentils, and peas have been found preserved in layers of peat. These weren't wild plants, gathered by chance. They were cultivated crops. Fields would have been located on nearby dry land. Simple wooden plows were likely used to turn the soil. Flint blades were inserted into wooden sickles for harvesting. After harvest, grain had to be dried, processed, and stored carefully to survive winter. But farming wasn't their only food source. Large amounts of fish bones have been found at many lake settlements. They used woven nets, bone hooks, and fish traps placed in shallow water. Some sites even suggest seasonal fishing patterns. They also hunted in surrounding forests. Red deer, wild boar, smaller game, flint arrowheads, and bone-tipped spears were commonly used. Animal husbandry played a major role too. Cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs were kept and cared for. Milk may have been processed into early forms of cheese. And then there was gathering. Wild apples, berries, mushrooms. The forest added variety to their diet. When we imagine prehistoric life, we often imagine randomness and chaos. But what we see instead here are systems and techniques. Here I added a garden house. I wanted food production to be present at least in some way in the setting. The lower level holds planters and tools, while the upper greenhouse protects more delicate plants. And then the side structures act kind of as a wind and sun protection as well. Here's the strange part. Even with all that was uncovered, we still know so little. We don't know what language these people spoke. We don't know their myths, their songs, or what names they gave to the lakes they lived on. But we do know how carefully they built. Tree-ring dating. This word allows researchers to determine the exact year some wooden posts were cut. In certain settlements, we can identify construction phases down to a single season. Many villages show evidence of rebuilding in the exact same location over generations. Posts were replaced, platforms were reinforced, layouts were maintained. Settlements were often arranged in clusters, with houses connected by wooden walkways. Some were built directly over shallow water, others stood on marshy ground along lake shores. The idea that all pile dwellings floated far above deep water is actually a misconception. Many were built just high enough to protect from flooding and damp soil, and the craftsmanship required to build such structures was impressive. Stone axes were used to chop down trees. Timber had to be shaped using only simple tools, usually made of stone. Wooden beams were aligned and secured without any modern fasteners. It's easy to call prehistoric communities simple, but simple societies don't produce long-term settlements such as these. And they also had trading, textile production, farming, and so much more. Even if we don't know their stories, their construction choices tell us a lot. They understood their environment and they built with it, not against it. You know, I do wonder what these people called themselves back then. This building sits on a slightly raised platform, making it a bit different from the others. Since the pile-dwelling settlements usually functioned as tight-knit communities, I imagine this building being a shared space for multiple families. The pond here breaks up the large flat surface. I think that without it, the platform would have felt a bit too heavy and maybe a bit dull. No one knows exactly why these settlements disappeared. As said, there is very little evidence of large-scale warfare on these lake sites. That doesn't mean conflict didn't exist, of course. It simply means surviving the elements seemed to have been the priority. Some believe the disappearance was gradual, and environmental changes likely played a major role. Water levels rose and fell over decades and centuries. Shorelines shifted. Soil fertility changed, marshland expanded or retreated. If flooding became too frequent, rebuilding may no longer have been worth the effort. Others suggest something more abrupt, a fire maybe, an illness, or something more mysterious. In local folklore, the marshes were never just quiet landscapes. They were alive, full of spirits and omens. There are tales of lights dancing over the water, of whispers in the reeds. Some stories tell of people entering the mist and not returning the same. But even today, locals will say, "The marsh remembers." The more I learned about the pile dwellers, the more practical and impressive their choices seemed. They studied their environment and were able to achieve so much with just the simple tools they had. This build is obviously just a very simple interpretation of their spaces, but the core idea remains the same: living with the landscape instead of fighting it. Thousands of years ago, they built above water because they had to, and today we build there because we can. The walkways connecting all of the buildings ended up being one of my favorite parts. They give this build structure and make the layout feel intentional rather than just scattered. I also softened the sharp edges of our square lake here. Perfect geometry can easily feel too artificial. And I also introduced reeds, lilies, and a few trees. I think the greenery helps the architecture blend into the landscape and make the entire scene feel more natural and lived in. I hope you enjoyed stepping into this world with me. If you did, you're welcome to subscribe and join me for future builds and stories. I'll also be adding summary-style review videos soon. And that's it. As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, cheers!